In the vast tapestry of life, there are moments so distant and fragile that they almost seem like whispers from a dream. 7 million years ago, long before cities, roads, or even the first flicker of human language, the world was a different place entirely. Africa, the cradle of humanity, stretched across sweeping savannas, dense forests, and rivers that carved their way through lands untouched by human hands. The air was thick with the scent of earth and vegetation, punctuated by the cries of unseen creatures moving through shadowed undergrowth. It was in this landscape, in the hidden folds of time, that the first hints of humanity began to appear. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, a slight shift in posture, a curious glance at the world, a hesitant step away from the security of the trees. Yet these small movements would ripple through time, shaping the course of life itself. Our journey begins not with a bang, but with a quiet emergence. Life had been experimenting for millions of years, creating creatures of all shapes and sizes, each adapted to its own corner of the earth. Among them, a lineage of primates began to walk a precarious path between the branches and the ground. They were not yet human, not yet the species that would one day build civilizations, paint stories on cave walls, or question the stars. But they carried within them the seeds of possibility, the capacity to see the world not only as it was, but as it could be. These early ancestors were small, fragile, and often overlooked in the grand theater of evolution, yet their every decision, every careful step, was part of a larger narrative that would span millions of years. Imagine the forest at dawn. Mist rises from the earth, curling around the trunks of ancient trees. A young hominin, barely taller than a modern-day child, moves cautiously through the underbrush. Its eyes, sharp and aware, scan for both food and threat. Nearby, a troop of monkeys chatters noisily, unaware of this new presence, while predators lurk in the distance, patient and silent. Every movement is a negotiation with survival. Every choice, whether to climb, to flee, or to stay, carries consequences. In these moments, the first sparks of human ingenuity flicker. The ability to reason, to remember, to anticipate danger, begins to distinguish these early ancestors from the rest of the animal kingdom. It is tempting to imagine that evolution is a straight line, a ladder rising inexorably toward humanity. In reality, it is far more intricate, a web of possibilities with countless dead ends, detours, and experiments. For every lineage that survives, many vanish without leaving a trace. Fossils are rare glimpses into this hidden world, fragments of bones and teeth that tell stories we can only piece together. Each discovery, whether it is a jawbone half buried in rock or a solitary tooth worn by time, is a portal into the lives of creatures whose hearts once beat with the same urgency as ours. They remind us that humanity did not emerge fully formed, it was shaped through struggle, adaptation, and the delicate interplay between chance and necessity. The climate of the time was mercurial, shifting between lush forests and open grasslands. Rainfall patterns changed unpredictably, rivers swelled and receded, and the land itself seemed alive with tension. Early hominins had to navigate this world with acute awareness. Bipedalism, the ability to walk on two legs, began as a subtle adaptation, offering a new perspective over tall grass, freeing the hands to carry food or tools, and allowing for more efficient long-distance travel. It may have seemed clumsy at first, a risky departure from the safety of the trees. Yet in those hesitant steps lay the blueprint for the species we would become. The first upright walkers embodied a quiet courage, venturing into uncertainty not because they knew what awaited them, but because survival demanded it. Even in these earliest times, there was a nascent sense of curiosity. The world was full of puzzles, strange plants, elusive prey, unpredictable weather. The ability to observe, to learn, and to experiment became as important as strength or speed. A hominin that noticed the behavior of an animal or the changing flow of a river gained an advantage, not only in survival but in understanding the rhythm of life. Each small insight, each careful observation, was a step toward intelligence, toward consciousness. In a sense, the first humans were not just surviving, they were beginning to think, to imagine, and to connect with the world in ways that no other creature had. There is a profound loneliness in considering this epoch. No other beings could explain the significance of these first steps. The forests and plains held only the raw rhythms of life: birth, hunger, fear, and reproduction. And yet, within these tiny, almost invisible moments, something extraordinary was unfolding. The ancestors of humanity were beginning to leave a mark not only on the world but on time itself. Their struggles, triumphs, and failures would echo across millennia, shaping landscapes, ecosystems, and ultimately, the mind that would look back on this story and wonder at its origins. 7 million years is almost incomprehensible, yet it is the span of a story that begins here, in the quiet interplay of life and environment. The hominins of this era were humble actors in a grand drama, unaware that their lineage would one day stretch across continents, carve mountains, and unlock the mysteries of the universe. And yet, it is precisely in this unassuming beginning, in the simple act of standing upright, that the essence of humanity first flickered into being. The journey ahead is long, filled with uncertainty and wonder, but it all begins in this primordial moment, where life first remembered itself, and the story of us began to unfold. The forest whispered with life, an intricate symphony of motion and sound that played without end. Here, amid the towering trees and tangled undergrowth of Africa, the world was both beautiful and merciless. 7 million years ago, the landscape was a shifting puzzle of dense woodland giving way to open savanna, rivers carving paths through the earth, and skies that could change from brilliant sunlight to sudden storms in moments. In this world lived Sahelanthropus cadensis, one of the earliest known creatures that might walk the line between ape and human. Fossils discovered millions of years later would reveal a skull with small, ape-like teeth, a flat face, and perhaps, most strikingly, the position of the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull, suggesting that this creature may have walked upright. It is a small detail, almost invisible to the untrained eye, yet it speaks volumes. Here was the first tentative experiment in leaving the forest floor behind. Imagine a lone individual moving cautiously among ferns and fallen branches. Muscles tense, eyes alert, it navigates the border between shadow and light, between predator and prey. The forest is alive with threats: leopards slinking through the undergrowth, snakes coiled silently in damp soil, and birds of prey circling high above. Each step is calculated, yet instinctive. Bipedalism may not yet have been perfected, but the very act of attempting it created a new relationship with the world. Heightened vision over tall grass, the freeing of hands for carrying food or tools, and the ability to travel efficiently across uneven terrain were not just advantages, they were a gamble with survival itself. Every step forward, every cautious glance, is a quiet defiance of the forces that seek to end life before it has a chance to unfold. The air is thick with the scent of earth and decay, the sweet aroma of fruit, and the distant tang of water. Here, life moves in rhythms older than memory. Yet even in this primeval environment, there is evidence of ingenuity. A crack of a nut on a stone, a carefully chosen branch to test the depth of a puddle, or the subtle mimicry of an animal's behavior shows the earliest flickers of learning. Sahelanthropus is not yet human, but its mind is awake in ways that hint at the future. Curiosity, observation, and cautious experimentation are the first threads of intelligence, fragile yet persistent. Each choice echoes across generations, shaping what will become a species capable of art, philosophy, and reflection. It is tempting to imagine this creature as heroic, moving boldly through the unknown. In truth, it is both daring and vulnerable, small in the vastness of its world. Alone, it confronts uncertainty and danger with nothing but instinct and a growing awareness of its body and surroundings. The forest, with its dense canopy and hidden predators, is a crucible, refining traits that will one day define humanity: balance, foresight, and adaptability. The stakes are immense, yet the actors are unaware of their place in a story that spans millions of years. They live only in the present, yet the consequences of their survival will resonate across continents and epochs. As the sun rises and filters through the trees, shadows shift and creatures stir. The forest is a tapestry of life, every branch, leaf, and stone a potential hazard or opportunity. Sahelanthropus navigates this world with a mixture of caution and experimentation, pausing to observe, to learn, to remember. Memory itself is becoming a tool of survival. The ability to recall the location of water, the movement patterns of predators, or the ripening of fruit is not merely instinct, it is the beginning of planning, the early stages of foresight. It is here, in these subtle cognitive leaps, that the first hints of what will one day be called human thought begin to appear. Time is both infinite and fleeting in this world. Seasons change, rivers swell and recede, and the forest shifts in response to climate and circumstance. Sahelanthropus adapts, moving between woodland and savanna, learning to navigate the challenges of each. Each step, each decision, is an experiment in survival, a negotiation with forces far larger than the individual. And yet, in this constant tension, there is beauty. The first glimmers of human perspective arise in the ability to see the world not just as it is, but as it might be used, explored, and understood. In this, there is wonder, a quiet awe that connects the first upright walkers to every human who will follow. The challenge of existence is amplified by the predators that share the land. Big cats, crocodiles, and venomous snakes stalk their prey with deadly patience. Food is scarce and must be sought with strategy and cooperation. Foraging, observing, and occasionally scavenging become lessons in resilience. Survival is a dialogue between risk and reward, instinct and innovation. Each narrow escape, each successful hunt or gathering of fruit, is a small triumph that strengthens the lineage and teaches the lessons that will echo across millennia. Even as Sahelanthropus faces these daily trials, it is shaping the long path of evolution in ways it cannot comprehend. The experimentation with upright walking, the careful observation of the environment, the tentative steps into a world both familiar and dangerous, all of these are the building blocks of human identity. They are not yet tools of civilization or thought in the way we understand them, but they are the first pages of a story that will eventually encompass cities, art, and self-reflection. In every careful step, there is courage, in every observation, a spark of curiosity, in every survival, a quiet assertion of existence. Looking back through the lens of millions of years, it is astonishing to realize that these small, fragile beings carried within them the potential for all that would follow. The first upright walkers remind us that humanity is not a sudden appearance, but the product of patience, adaptation, and the subtle courage to step into the unknown. In the quiet dawn of Africa, amidst the forests, rivers, and predators, the story of our lineage began, not with certainty, but with a fragile, tentative curiosity that would echo through time. Here, at the intersection of life and possibility, the first steps of humanity were taken, and the long journey toward consciousness and civilization quietly began. The world was changing. Forests that once stretched endlessly were fragmenting into pockets, giving way to grasslands and open plains. Watercourses shifted unpredictably, carving new paths and leaving dry stretches in their wake. In this shifting landscape, our ancestors were learning to move, adapt, and survive in ways that would define the lineage of humanity. Australopithecus, a small hominin whose fossils would later astonish scientists, lived in this delicate balance between forest and savanna. Its body, strong and agile, was built for climbing, yet its legs carried hints of upright walking, an experiment in freedom and perspective. Each step across the earth was a negotiation with gravity, terrain, and the unseen dangers that lurked in shadow. Picture a steep hillside in East Africa, morning mist curling among the rocks and trees. A small group of early hominins navigates this challenging terrain, gripping branches with skilled hands, pausing to assess the world around them. Every movement is deliberate. They are constantly aware of predators, of the unpredictable movements of other animals, of the need to forage for food while avoiding danger. In these early experiments with bipedalism, the hominins are testing more than just their bodies, they are testing the limits of awareness, coordination, and foresight. The forest teaches patience, the plains demand courage. To survive here is to learn a subtle, profound intimacy with the land. Alongside Auroran, another hominin, Ardipithecus ramidus, moves in the dense woodland. Unlike its more gracile contemporaries, it possesses a delicate balance of traits, hands adapted for climbing, yet feet that hint at the possibility of walking upright. Ardipithecus is a creature of contrasts, perfectly adapted to a world in flux. Its survival depends on observation and adaptability, on recognizing which branches can bear weight, which paths are safe, and how to navigate both the canopy and the forest floor. Life is a constant negotiation between risk and reward. To step too boldly is to invite danger, to hesitate too long is to miss opportunity. In these subtle movements, in the interplay of caution and exploration, lies the earliest flicker of strategy and planning. The climate presses upon them, shaping their existence. Rainfall is inconsistent, sometimes flooding the valleys, sometimes leaving them parched. Food is never guaranteed, and scarcity demands ingenuity. The hominins observe the behavior of animals, the ripening of fruit, the tracks left by larger creatures, and they adjust accordingly. Memory, attention, and learning are becoming essential tools of survival. Every decision carries consequences not just for the individual, but for the small group whose cooperation ensures collective survival. The bonds that form in these early communities are tentative yet vital, hints of the social intelligence that will one day characterize modern humans. As the sun rises higher, shadows lengthen and shift. The forest seems alive, an unpredictable force that demands attention. Birds cry overhead, insects swarm in chaotic patterns, and the wind stirs leaves and branches in a symphony of sound. For the hominins, every sense is alert. Sight, smell, hearing, and touch are all channels through which information flows, guiding decisions and shaping behavior. The first whispers of curiosity emerge here, not simply to survive, but to understand. To follow an unfamiliar scent, to investigate a strange sound, or to test the strength of a branch is to engage with the world in a way that hints at intelligence. These early experiments are small, almost imperceptible, yet they are the foundation of human cognition. There is a tension in their existence, a delicate balance between vulnerability and capability. Predators are never far away, leopards move silently through the undergrowth, snakes lie coiled and patient in the leaf litter, and large birds of prey watch from the canopy. Every moment carries the possibility of life or death. Yet within this tension, the hominins are learning to plan, to anticipate, and to act. They are experimenting with movement, posture, and strategy. They learn to judge distances, calculate effort, and remember safe routes. Each small success strengthens their ability to adapt, each failure becomes a lesson etched into memory. Survival is not merely a physical act, but a cognitive achievement. Auroran and Ardipithecus do not leave marks of civilization, they do not carve tools or build shelters in the way later hominins will. Yet they are laying the groundwork for what is to come. Their very existence, their experimentation with upright walking and interaction with an unpredictable environment, creates a subtle momentum through time. Every careful step forward, every measured climb, every cautious retreat into the safety of trees, is a rehearsal for the complexities that humanity will eventually confront. These creatures are the silent architects of adaptation, shaping bodies and behaviors that will ripple through generations. Time in this world is slow, measured not in years but in survival. Seasons shift imperceptibly, landscapes evolve gradually. Yet within these cycles, the hominins perceive patterns, subtle regularities in the chaos of nature. They begin to understand not just immediate dangers, but recurring rhythms, when rivers flood, when fruit ripens, when predators move. This emerging understanding, fragile yet persistent, is an early echo of what will one day be culture, observation, and science. They are learning not only to exist, but to anticipate, to imagine, and to respond to a world that is both generous and unforgiving. By evening, the forest is bathed in golden light, and the hominins rest in quiet observation. They have traversed hills and streams, avoided danger, and found sustenance. In their bodies, minds, and small communities, the first traces of human ingenuity are visible. They are not yet humans, but they carry within them the potential to become something more. In their steps, cautious and deliberate, is the earliest evidence of a species beginning to shape its own destiny. The interplay of environment, observation, and action is creating a subtle choreography that will echo across millions of years, culminating in the emergence of the genus Homo and, eventually, in the fully realized consciousness of modern humans. In this fragile, fleeting moment, the story of adaptation, experimentation, and curiosity is quietly unfolding. The forest, the hills, and the rivers witness the tentative steps of creatures who are learning to navigate not just the world around them, but the possibilities within themselves. It is here, amid mist and shadow, danger and discovery, that humanity's journey continues, small, uncertain, yet profoundly significant. Each movement, each choice, is a testament to life's enduring persistence and the quiet courage that will carry these ancestors forward through the eons. The world was different now. The great forests of the past had begun to recede, giving way to expansive savannas where the land seemed to stretch endlessly beneath a relentless sun. The towering trees were replaced by grasses and scattered shrubs, and the once lush, shadowy woodlands now felt open, vulnerable. In this vast, shifting landscape, a new figure appeared, moving slowly yet purposefully on two legs. This creature was not like the ones that had come before, but rather a precursor to something far greater. It was Australopithecus afarensis, and it would become one of the most iconic and important figures in the story of humanity. The first glimpse we get of Lucy, the most famous of Australopithecus afarensis, is a glimpse of something both fragile and extraordinary. Standing barely over 3 feet tall, with a small brain and a face that still carried the unmistakable mark of its primate ancestors, Lucy was not the first upright creature to walk the earth. But she was the first to showcase a profound shift, one that would gradually give rise to the human form we recognize today. Her bones, so delicately preserved in the Ethiopian soil, tell a story of adaptation and survival. They tell of a body built for both the trees and the ground, able to move through the branches of the ancient forest but just as capable of navigating the open spaces of the savanna on 2 feet. In every way, Lucy represents the crossroads of evolution, where life began to leave the trees behind but was still deeply connected to the primal forest. To witness Lucy in motion is to watch the first inklings of what it might mean to be human. Her gait is imperfect, tentative, yet undeniably upright. Each step she takes is an experiment in balance, in adapting to the challenges of a world that demands new ways of thinking, of being. It is a walk fraught with tension, between instinct and intellect, between the primal urges of the forest and the growing awareness of the savanna stretching out before her. Her legs are shorter than those of later hominins, her arms longer, more adapted to climbing than to walking. But it is in this very duality that we see the beginnings of humanity's most defining characteristic, the ability to be both of the earth and apart from it. She carries the echoes of our arboreal past in her body while also hinting at the capacity to rise above it, to adapt, to walk freely and confidently. In Lucy's world, survival is a dance of constant vigilance. The predators that share the land with her are swift, clever, and deadly. The grasses hide dangers, and the open ground offers little protection. Yet Lucy and her kind are learning to thrive in this new, exposed environment. Her hands, which still bear the marks of a life lived in the trees, begin to show signs of becoming tools. The stones she picks up, the sticks she uses to probe the earth, all become extensions of herself, ways to test her surroundings, to navigate the ever-present risks of life on the savanna. She is not yet a toolmaker in the way that later hominins will be, but her small innovations are the first steps toward that future. As Lucy moves through the world, she does not move alone. She is part of a group, a family, a social unit whose survival depends not just on individual skill but on cooperation. The group relies on one another for protection, for knowledge, and for support. In the shifting dynamics of this early hominin society, we can begin to see the first seeds of what will one day become human culture. The bonds that form between Lucy and her fellow hominins are the beginnings of language, of social rituals, of the emotional depth that will come to define human life. Every moment spent in the safety of the group, every shared meal or night spent huddled together, is an act of survival, but also an act of connection. The trust they place in each other, the ways in which they communicate, whether through gesture, sound, or shared understanding, are the nascent threads of the complex social fabric that will eventually define our species. There is an undeniable poignancy in considering Lucy's world, in imagining the steps she took across the African landscape. Her existence is marked by fragility. Her bones, so small and delicate, are evidence of a life lived in constant negotiation with the environment. Yet in her body is the potential for something far greater. She is not just a creature of instinct, but one that carries within it the first hints of thought, of awareness, of a mind beginning to shape its own destiny. In the grand scheme of evolution, Lucy's life was brief. But the legacy she left behind, written in the bones of her species, is profound. The adaptations she embodied, walking upright, using tools, living in a group, were the first steps toward a future that would see humans spread across the globe, build civilizations, and reach for the stars. The transformation from Australopithecus to Homo is not a sudden leap, but a gradual evolution, a story told in the slow accumulation of small changes over millennia. What we see in Lucy is not just the beginning of a species, but the beginning of consciousness itself. In her tentative steps across the African savanna, in her interactions with the world around her, we glimpse the first stirrings of human awareness, the capacity to look beyond survival, to seek knowledge, to wonder about the world, and perhaps, in some quiet, unknowable way, to begin questioning what it means to be alive. In Lucy's life, we see not only the roots of humanity but the potential for all that humanity will become. And in her bones, we hear the distant echoes of the journey that will one day lead us to places far beyond this ancient landscape. The savanna stretched out, a landscape both open and vulnerable. The towering trees that once provided shelter and shade were now far in the distance, and the forest's once thick canopy had begun to recede. In this new world, the Australopithecus were not alone. Alongside Australopithecus afarensis, there were other hominin species, each carving out its own niche in the shifting ecosystems of ancient Africa. These were creatures that, like Lucy, were beginning to experiment with what it meant to be human. They were not all the same. Each species had its own set of adaptations, each pursuing its own path through the ever-changing environment, and yet they were bound by a shared lineage, a common thread that would one day connect them all to the genus Homo. There was Australopithecus africanus, another close relative to afarensis, found in the southern regions of Africa. Unlike Lucy, Africanus had a slightly smaller, more rounded skull and a more developed face, perhaps hinting at an early form of social intelligence. This species, too, had mastered bipedalism, though its limbs and body were still very much built for climbing. Its adaptations to the savanna were different, reflecting a world in flux, where resources were scattered and the dangers of predators and the environment were ever present. There is something almost mysterious in the way Africanus lived, its bones scattered across the landscape, its life a quiet series of adaptations that left no grand marks upon history. Yet, in its survival, it shared the same quiet defiance that would characterize all human ancestors, a refusal to be swallowed by the shifting forces of nature. Then there was Australopithecus sediba, a more recent discovery, whose fossils have revealed a creature still embedded in the ancient ways of the forest but showing some early signs of behavior and anatomy that would later be seen in the genus Homo. The remains of sediba reveal a body that was not quite like its predecessors, but not quite like humans either. It walked upright but still had long, dexterous arms, perhaps to climb or to manipulate tools. The shape of its pelvis and the structure of its legs suggested an increasingly efficient way of walking, a refinement of the bipedalism that began with afarensis. Yet its brain, though larger than that of its relatives, was still small by modern standards, offering only faint echoes of the intelligence that would later drive the evolution of modern humans. Australopithecus sediba stands as a reminder that evolution does not move in straight lines but in an intricate web of experimentation, with many branches and paths taken, some leading to nowhere, some to new and unexpected directions. The differences among these Australopithecus species were not just anatomical but behavioral. Some may have had different social structures, different ways of interacting with the environment, and different strategies for survival. In one way, they were all testing possibilities, seeing how far the human blueprint could stretch and adapt. They were living experiments in bipedalism, in tool use, in social cooperation, and in intelligence. And yet, none of them could have known that their very differences, their variations, would one day fuel the rise of a new species, one that would begin to leave its mark not just on Africa but on the entire planet. The savanna was a vast, open world, and yet it was a world of competition, of constant tension between survival and extinction. The Australopithecus species were not the only ones vying for resources in this changing environment. There were large predators, cats and hyenas that moved across the land with silent precision, birds of prey that circled high above, and the occasional crocodile that lurked in the river's murky depths. Every moment in the life of an Australopithecus was fraught with danger. Yet there was also opportunity. The open spaces of the savanna, though treacherous, offered new ways of seeing, new ways of interacting with the environment. The ability to stand tall on two legs was not just an adaptation for avoiding predators, it also allowed Australopithecus to spot prey from a distance, to see the world from a vantage point that was once impossible. Standing upright meant being able to travel farther, to forage more effectively, and to escape the danger that lurked in the grass. In many ways, it gave them a kind of freedom, a chance to adapt to a rapidly changing world. Despite their differences, these species shared common traits. They were all creatures in flux, constantly adjusting to an ever-changing world. They were creatures of observation, learning from their environment, from each other, and from the challenges of survival. The bonds that formed within their groups were essential, not just for physical survival, but for emotional and social cooperation. In these early communities, we begin to see the faint outline of something that would become a hallmark of humanity, the ability to cooperate and communicate, to form social networks that allowed for more than mere survival but for the development of culture. It is in these groups that early forms of bonding, social structure, and even empathy began to take root. What we learn from these diverse species is that human evolution is not a straight, linear process but a tapestry of experimentation, adaptation, and trial. There is no singular path that leads from Australopithecus to Homo sapiens, rather, it is a branching web of possibilities, some of which will bear fruit and some of which will fall into oblivion. But each species that came before us, each step along the way, played a crucial role in shaping the destiny of humankind. In their struggles, their differences, and their adaptations, we see the early roots of human identity. They were not just living to survive, they were living to adapt, to overcome, and to change the world in ways they could never have imagined. These early ancestors, in all their diversity, represent the essence of humanity itself, a species capable of enduring, of evolving, of learning from the past and adapting for the future. They were not just survivors, they were the architects of something far greater. Their lives, though brief in the span of time, are the beginning of the long and winding road that would one day lead to the rise of humanity. And in their bones, scattered across the African landscape, lies the story of all that we have become. The winds of change swept across the African landscape. The towering trees were becoming increasingly rare, their canopies replaced by wide stretches of open grasslands and scattered savannas. The rhythm of the earth was shifting, and with it, so too was the world of the hominins. In this new, open world, the first hints of tool use were beginning to emerge. The stones, once mere objects of the earth, were being picked up, tested, and altered. What had once been a tool for survival now began to transform into an instrument of change. The hominins had begun to engage with the world in ways that were far beyond simple survival, they were learning to shape it. This was a world where intelligence and dexterity could become as valuable as strength and speed. By this time, Australopithecus species had begun to evolve into more specialized forms, but the line between them and the emerging Homo genus was still a blurry one. It was around this time that Homo habilis emerged, a pivotal species that marked the first clear step toward the genus Homo. Standing just slightly taller than its predecessors, Homo habilis exhibited a number of key changes in both anatomy and behavior that distinguished it from its ancestors. Its brain, though still small compared to modern humans, was larger than that of Australopithecus, offering more room for cognitive development. The shape of the hands and fingers was more refined, better suited for manipulating tools. This new species was on the cusp of something profound, an ability to create, to innovate, and to modify the world around them in ways that would set the stage for everything that came after. Imagine a small group of Homo habilis moving through the grasslands. Their hands, once only useful for climbing or gripping, are now engaged in a task of a different nature. They are collecting rocks, breaking them against one another, shaping them into tools. It is a quiet moment of invention, one that will be repeated across generations. The tools they make are not just for immediate survival, they are symbols of a shift in thinking. No longer are these hominins merely reacting to their environment, trying to survive in the chaos of the world. Now, they are shaping their surroundings, manipulating them to suit their needs. The ability to alter the environment, to take raw materials and shape them into something useful, is the beginning of technology. But tool use was not just about creating weapons or instruments for survival. It was about expanding the possibilities of the world. With the tools they created, Homo habilis could cut meat, break open tough plant material, and engage with the environment in new ways. Their ability to process food more efficiently may have given them more energy, perhaps leading to changes in diet and social structure. The act of toolmaking would have also fostered social cooperation. In groups, individuals could share knowledge of where to find the best materials, how to sharpen a stone, and how to use their tools effectively. The exchange of knowledge and the division of labor within these small groups set the stage for the kind of complex social structures that would later define humanity. The emergence of Homo habilis was not just a turning point in terms of anatomy or behavior, it marked a moment in the development of the human mind. The ability to plan, to envision something beyond the immediate present, is one of the hallmarks of human intelligence. When Homo habilis crafted tools, they were not simply responding to a need, they were anticipating it, considering how to shape the future. This leap in cognitive ability is still a mystery in many ways, but it marked the beginning of the kind of forward thinking that would eventually lead to the rise of civilization. Life was still full of danger, though. The savanna, with its wide expanses, offered little cover from predators. The hominins had to be constantly on the lookout for the larger carnivores that roamed the land. In this environment, the ability to communicate, to signal danger, to organize in response to a threat, would have been invaluable. Early communication, perhaps through simple vocalizations or gestures, would have played a key role in the survival of these small groups. The social bonds that were formed within these groups were not just about cooperation, they were about survival. For all the progress that Homo habilis had made, the journey toward full humanity was still long. The species continued to evolve, slowly refining its body and mind. Its brain, though larger than that of its predecessors, was still not fully developed, and its tools, while more advanced, were still primitive by modern standards. But it was in these small, incremental steps, each one a push against the boundaries of the world, that the foundation for human culture and society was laid. The tools, the cooperation, the early communication, each of these things was a precursor to the complexity of human life that would follow. In the grand narrative of human evolution, Homo habilis is a pivotal chapter. It is a species that lived on the edge of the known world, where the possibilities for survival were endless, and yet the dangers were constant. Their lives, though humble, were marked by the first tentative steps toward a new way of being in the world. They were no longer mere animals, no longer simply reacting to the world around them. They were beginning to shape it, to mold it, to influence the course of nature itself. And in this quiet revolution, they were setting the stage for the rise of everything that we, as humans, would become. As the sun sank lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, the landscape of ancient Africa seemed to breathe in rhythm with the creatures that moved across it. The earth was still wild, untamed, and filled with untold dangers. Yet something new was stirring, something that would gradually transform the world. It was an era of quiet innovation and profound adaptation. The hominins, who had once been simple survivors, were now becoming creators. The emergence of Homo erectus, the next major step in the evolutionary journey, marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which human potential could finally begin to unfold. Homo erectus was not merely a continuation of the path set by Homo habilis. It was a leap forward, a species that began to show what true adaptation could look like. Standing taller than its predecessors and with a body more suited to endurance, Homo erectus had a more refined, sophisticated approach to survival. Their bones and tools revealed a species that was not just surviving, but thriving. They had mastered the art of walking long distances, using their bodies more efficiently than ever before, and perhaps even learning to control fire, an achievement that would change the course of human history. The control of fire was a pivotal moment in the story of humanity. Imagine a group of Homo erectus, gathered around a campfire on a cool evening, the warmth of the flames casting flickering shadows on the faces of those gathered. The fire was not just a source of warmth, it was a tool that would extend their day, provide protection from predators, and allow them to cook food more easily. Cooking, in turn, made food more digestible, unlocking more nutrients and providing more energy. This was a game-changer for Homo erectus, who now had more time and resources to engage in activities beyond mere survival. The mastery of fire marked the moment when human ingenuity began to stretch beyond the natural world and into the realm of invention. But fire was not just a practical tool, it was also a social force. Gathering around the fire, Homo erectus began to form social bonds that went beyond immediate survival needs. The warmth and light of the fire provided a space for conversation, for storytelling, for sharing knowledge. It was here, in the flickering shadows, that the first rudiments of culture began to emerge. Early language, communication, and perhaps even ritual began to take shape. The fire was a focal point, a place where ideas could be exchanged, where the young could learn from the elders, and where the social fabric of early human life could begin to coalesce. Yet the story of Homo erectus is not just about fire and tools, it is also about movement. Unlike earlier hominins, Homo erectus was capable of covering vast distances. Their long legs, efficient gait, and endurance allowed them to explore and settle in regions far beyond their ancestral homeland in Africa. Fossils of Homo erectus have been found as far as Asia and Europe, evidence of a species that was not just confined to one place but was actively engaged in a process of migration. In this respect, Homo erectus was the first true explorer, traveling across unfamiliar territories, adapting to new environments, and laying the groundwork for the spread of humans across the globe. This migration would come to define humanity, as humans, unlike any other species, would come to occupy every continent. The movement of Homo erectus across the continents was not just an accident of survival, but a testament to the species' flexibility and resilience. They adapted to a variety of climates, from the warm savannas to the cold, northern latitudes. They learned to make shelter, to hunt in new environments, and to take advantage of the resources around them. They were a species constantly learning, constantly adapting to their surroundings. Their mastery of tools was growing as well, moving beyond the simple stone tools of their ancestors to more sophisticated implements, including hand axes and cleavers. The development of such tools was a reflection of a growing intelligence, one that was beginning to not only adapt to the environment but to shape it. As Homo erectus spread across the globe, the world itself began to change. The species was no longer limited to the African continent, but had spread into regions with harsh winters, dense forests, and unforgiving landscapes. The challenges of these new environments forced Homo erectus to innovate in ways that would eventually give rise to new forms of culture and society. The migrations of Homo erectus were the first steps in what would eventually become the great human diaspora. Their expansion marked the beginning of human history as we know it, the moment when humans first began to spread their influence beyond Africa, and when the potential of human culture began to take root. But despite their advancements, the lives of Homo erectus were still shaped by the harsh realities of their environment. They were not yet masters of the earth, and survival was still a constant struggle. Predators were still a threat, and food sources were not always guaranteed. Yet it is in these very challenges that we see the earliest foundations of human resilience. Homo erectus was a species that was not just surviving but thriving in an ever-changing world. They were beginning to understand the world on a deeper level, and in doing so, were beginning to shape their own fate. As we look back at Homo erectus, we see not only a species of survival but a species of transformation. They were the bridge between the early hominins and the modern human beings who would follow. Their mastery of fire, their migration across continents, and their ever-growing intelligence laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. They were the pioneers, the first to explore, to adapt, to create, and their legacy can still be felt today, in the very tools we use and the way we shape the world around us. The firelight flickered and danced as night descended across the savanna. In the glow of the flames, a new era of human development was quietly beginning to unfold. Homo erectus, though still very much rooted in the ancient ways of survival, had begun to leave behind the wilderness of the past and step into something more. This was no longer just a species of tool users and fire makers. This was a species beginning to wrestle with something far more abstract, the question of self. As they traveled across continents, adapting to new and unfamiliar environments, Homo erectus was no longer simply responding to nature. They were beginning to shape it. And, in shaping nature, they were also beginning to shape their own place in the world. At some point, deep in the heart of these early human communities, something extraordinary began to stir. It was the emergence of an increasingly complex social structure, an awareness that survival could not rely solely on individual prowess but on cooperation. The groups of Homo erectus were no longer just loosely connected bands of individuals, they were increasingly cohesive, organized units bound together by shared goals, shared resources, and shared responsibility. This was the birth of social cohesion, a defining characteristic of humanity that would come to dominate our species. As groups huddled around fires, exchanging knowledge, keeping watch over one another, and working together to gather food, the very fabric of human society was taking root. With each passing day, the complexity of their social lives deepened. Though their technology was still rudimentary by modern standards, it was already clear that the mental leap required to produce such tools was profound. They were not just using objects to survive, they were beginning to understand the world around them on a deeper level. The ability to craft a stone tool, to control fire, to communicate across distances, these were all actions that required not just instinct but thought, foresight, and intention. And this shift, this slow and deliberate push toward greater cognitive and social complexity, was what would eventually allow Homo erectus to transcend the limitations of the environment and make its mark on history. In the context of this evolving social structure, early communication played a pivotal role. The vocalizations that Homo erectus made were likely simple at first, short bursts of sound used to signal danger or rally the group. But over time, these vocalizations would have grown more nuanced, more refined. Early forms of language began to emerge, not just for immediate needs but for the deeper purposes of cooperation, coordination, and community. The very act of gathering around the fire to share warmth also became a means of sharing ideas, emotions, and stories. As humans learned to communicate more effectively, the bonds between them grew stronger. These bonds would lay the groundwork for the complex social structures that would come to define the human experience. Yet, even as Homo erectus embraced the complexity of social life, they were still deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. They were still creatures of the earth, still tied to the land in ways that were visceral and immediate. The seasons shaped their existence. Food came in waves, in cycles, and their very survival depended on their ability to read the signs of the natural world. Their mastery of fire, their ability to make tools, allowed them to alter their environment, but they could not escape the forces of nature that continued to dictate their lives. Survival was still fragile, and the world they inhabited was one that could be unforgiving. The tools they crafted were no longer just functional, they were an extension of their minds. These early humans began to experiment with form, refining their tools, shaping them for specific tasks. The hand axes and cleavers they used became more specialized, demonstrating a growing sophistication in their understanding of materials and design. These tools were not just for hunting or foraging, they were a symbol of the growing intelligence of Homo erectus. With each new innovation, they were pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But their innovations were not isolated or singular, they were shared. What one member of the group learned, the others learned. The knowledge was passed down, accumulated, and refined over generations. This exchange of knowledge, this building upon what came before, was the beginning of human culture. It was here, around the fire, in the exchange of tools, ideas, and stories, that culture was born. As Homo erectus spread further across the globe, from Africa to Asia and Europe, their ability to adapt to different environments became even more evident. They did not simply survive in these new landscapes, they transformed them. In the cold, northern climates, they learned to shelter themselves against the elements, developing more sophisticated methods of clothing, shelter, and hunting. In the dense forests of Asia, they adapted their hunting strategies to the terrain, learning to stalk prey through the underbrush and to use the environment to their advantage. Their mobility, their flexibility, and their creativity allowed them to thrive in environments that were once inhospitable. In a way, Homo erectus was not just a species defined by survival but by resilience, a species that had learned to shape itself to its surroundings, no matter how challenging or alien they may have been. The journey of Homo erectus was far from easy. Their lives were marked by hardship, by struggle, and by the constant push to adapt. But it was in these very challenges that the seeds of modern humanity were planted. Their ability to work together, to share knowledge, to communicate, and to shape the environment around them would become the hallmark of our species. As we look back on Homo erectus, we see the first stirrings of human culture, the first steps toward a civilization that would one day span the globe. Their legacy is not just in the tools they left behind or the places they settled, it is in the very fabric of human life, the social bonds, the exchange of ideas, and the drive to transcend the limitations of the natural world. As the days grew longer and the seasons changed, a new chapter in the human story began to unfold. The world was growing colder, and new challenges awaited the early humans who had already shown such remarkable resilience. The landscape had changed yet again. What had once been an expanse of savannas and open forests was now shifting toward more varied, colder climates. The ice ages were on the horizon, and with it came new hurdles for survival. For the species that had been so adept at adapting to the African savanna, the North presented an entirely different set of challenges. And yet, it was here, in the face of these challenges, that humanity's ability to innovate and cooperate would be tested in ways never before seen. Homo erectus had already shown their capacity for movement and adaptability, stretching across continents, from Africa to Asia and Europe. But now, the world they had ventured into was becoming more hostile. The colder environments brought with them harsher winters, fewer resources, and a more unforgiving landscape. The environment was transforming, and the hominins who had once thrived in the warm African savannas now had to find new ways to survive in the ice and snow. But what marked Homo erectus as different from the other creatures of the earth was their remarkable ability to endure. Their intelligence and creativity, perhaps more than any other species, had given them the means to not just survive, but to thrive in an ever-changing world. In the frigid landscapes of Ice Age Europe, Homo erectus began to encounter new dangers. Mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, and rhinoceroses roamed the land, their massive forms a constant reminder of the world's fierce power. But the intelligence of Homo erectus proved to be more than just survival instinct, it was a force of creation. The tools they fashioned to hunt, protect themselves, and build shelter grew ever more refined. What had once been basic hand axes and stone tools were now turned into spears, blades, and scrapers, more specialized and more effective for the new world they were facing. But it was not just the physical tools that defined them, it was their ability to work as a team, to communicate, and to plan. For the first time, humans were beginning to see the real benefits of cooperation in survival. Where once individuals might have worked alone, now entire groups were coming together to strategize, hunt, and protect one another. The roles within these groups began to solidify. Some were hunters, others gathered food, and still others may have stayed behind to care for the young or the injured. Each individual's skills were essential, and every task played a part in the survival of the group. Cooperation and shared effort became not only a means of survival but the foundation for a growing social structure. It was here, in the heart of these Ice Age communities, that we begin to see the first stirrings of the cooperative human nature that would later give rise to the complexities of human civilization. As the harsh cold of the Ice Age gripped the northern regions, humans began to develop methods of shelter that would allow them to survive in the bitter climate. They made use of animal skins and bones, crafting clothing that could protect them from the freezing temperatures. They built shelters from bones and hides, creating insulated spaces that could shield them from the wind and cold. But what stands out most in this era is the growing sense of innovation, the ability to use the materials around them in creative ways. They did not merely exist alongside the environment, they changed it. Every shelter they built, every piece of clothing they crafted, and every tool they used was a reflection of their ability to transform the world around them into something that served their needs. The harshness of their environment had forced them to think creatively, to innovate, and to adapt in ways that would define human survival for millennia to come. Beyond the physical adaptations, something deeper was taking root. The Ice Age was not just a time of survival, it was a time of cultural development. For the first time, early humans began to engage in symbolic thinking. In the caves of Europe, where the cold was ever present, early humans left their marks. The cave paintings, some of the earliest known examples of art, depicted animals, hunting scenes, and abstract symbols. These paintings were not merely decoration, they were part of something much larger. They were a form of communication, of storytelling, of passing down knowledge. The creation of these images marked a leap in cognitive development, a sign that humans were beginning to understand the world in more abstract terms. The images left behind in the caves also pointed to a growing sense of spirituality or belief. The depiction of animals in the caves may not have simply been a record of hunts, they may have been an expression of reverence for the creatures that provided sustenance. The early humans of the Ice Age may have seen the animals not just as prey, but as companions in the struggle for survival, worthy of respect and care. This emerging spirituality was a marker of something more than mere survival. It was a reflection of a deepening human consciousness, a growing awareness of the world and their place within it. The Ice Age, though harsh and unforgiving, was a time of incredible innovation and cultural growth. The challenges of the environment pushed Homo erectus, and their descendants, toward new ways of thinking, of living, and of being. The mastery of fire, the creation of tools, the development of social structures, the building of shelter, and the growth of culture, all of these things were born out of necessity. Yet, in that necessity, something greater was forged, a species capable not only of surviving in a brutal world, but of shaping that world in ways that would leave a lasting legacy. The development of early human culture, art, and spirituality during the Ice Age set the stage for everything that would follow in human history. It was the beginning of the road that would lead humanity from survival to civilization, from instinct to culture, from mere existence to a deeply meaningful way of being. The cold winds of the Ice Age howled across the land, and yet, within the caves and shelters of early humans, something profound was taking place. The struggle to survive had turned into a struggle to understand, to connect, and to transcend. For the first time in the history of our species, humans were no longer just reacting to the world around them, they were shaping their reality through new tools, new forms of communication, and new ways of thinking. The ice may have dominated the landscape, but it was the fire that burned in the hearts of early humans that would ignite a transformation in both their physical existence and their conceptual understanding of the world. In this shifting world, the foundations of human culture were being laid down, and with it, the beginning of a deep and lasting connection to one another and to the land they inhabited. In the caves of Europe, where the cold and isolation could have easily stifled creativity, early humans found a way to express themselves. The first known cave paintings, some dating back over 30,000 years, offer a glimpse into the minds of those who lived at the edge of the world. These ancient paintings are not mere depictions of the animals that roamed the earth, they are windows into a world of meaning and ritual, a time when the boundaries between the material and spiritual worlds were often blurred. The images on the cave walls tell stories of hunting and survival, of the animals that were central to their lives, but they also tell something deeper. These were not just marks made for the sake of recording history or marking a successful hunt, they were acts of reverence, of spiritual significance, perhaps even of hope. What did these images mean to the people who painted them? Were they offering a tribute to the animals they depended on for food and clothing? Were they attempting to communicate with the spirit world or seeking protection for their tribes? The answer is lost to history, but what remains clear is that these early humans had begun to understand the power of symbols. They had learned to express their ideas, their beliefs, and their hopes in visual form. This ability to represent abstract concepts through images marked a crucial step in the evolution of the human mind, an ability that would lay the foundation for language, art, religion, and culture itself. The paintings were not simply about the act of hunting or survival, they were about identity. They were a reflection of a people seeking to understand their place in the world, and perhaps, seeking to control it. These early forms of art were not isolated incidents but part of a broader cultural shift. In these early human communities, social bonds were deepening. What began as simple survival-driven cooperation among family groups was now becoming something more complex. Early humans began to understand the importance of shared rituals and collective memory. The act of storytelling, both through word and image, became a vital means of preserving knowledge and strengthening social ties. Over time, these early rituals and stories would evolve into the complex mythologies, religions, and cultures that define human societies today. But in the Ice Age, they were still raw, unformed expressions of human thought. Yet the impulse was there, the impulse to explain, to create, and to connect. The symbolism of the cave paintings, though powerful, was just one aspect of this cultural shift. It was not just the art that was evolving, it was the very way humans understood themselves and their world. The Ice Age was a time when early humans began to question their place in the cosmos. No longer content with simply surviving, they began to ask, what was the meaning of their lives? What forces governed the world around them? And, perhaps most importantly, what lay beyond the immediate world of survival? This period marked the emergence of something uniquely human, the ability to reflect on the world, to dream, and to envision possibilities beyond the present. But even as early humans turned their attention inward, they remained tied to the land. The Ice Age was not an easy time to live, and the fight for survival was ever present. The cold, the scarcity of food, and the constant threat of predators forced humans to rely not only on their intelligence but on their ability to work together. The family and social group were no longer simply survival units, they were the bedrock of early human society. Trust, cooperation, and the sharing of resources became essential. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle had evolved into a complex network of interdependencies, and every member of the group had a role to play. The challenges of the Ice Age, however, were not just external. There was also a psychological toll to be paid. The long winters, the constant struggle for food, and the isolation of living in small groups in the harshest environments of the world undoubtedly weighed on the early humans. But it is perhaps within these very challenges that we see the seeds of human resilience. Humans had learned to adapt to the world around them, but more importantly, they had learned to find meaning in their struggles. Art, culture, and social bonds became ways of coping with the hardship of life. Where the physical world might have been harsh, the world of the mind and spirit had become a sanctuary. Despite the ever-present dangers, the Ice Age was a time of quiet revolution. The mastery of fire, the creation of tools, the development of social structures, and the birth of art and ritual all pointed toward a species not just surviving but thriving in ways that were uniquely human. These early humans had faced adversity, yes, but they had also begun to transcend it. They had begun to create a world that was no longer just about physical survival but about understanding, meaning, and connection. The dawn of human culture had begun. The ability to imagine, to create, to give meaning to the world, these were the hallmarks of humanity, the traits that would carry the species forward into the unknown future. And though they did not know it, the seeds of civilization, art, philosophy, and society were being planted in the flickering shadows of their fires and in the sacred images they painted on the cave walls. As the centuries passed and the seasons unfolded, a new and transformative phase began to take shape in the story of early humans. The Ice Age, once a harsh and unforgiving period of survival, began to give way to a world that felt increasingly hospitable. The long winters, the relentless cold, and the scarcity of food slowly retreated as the Earth entered a new period, a time when the world began to warm. The landscape changed, plants and animals adapted, and the human species, with its ever-growing intelligence and resourcefulness, stood on the cusp of something far greater than mere survival. This was a moment of opportunity, a time for innovation, expansion, and transformation. And it was during this critical juncture that Homo sapiens, the species we now recognize as ourselves, began to emerge from the shadows of their predecessors. It's often said that it was the rise of Homo sapiens that marked the true beginning of human civilization, but in reality, the path to modern humanity was long, winding, and paved with countless trials and successes. As the ice receded, the Earth slowly began to recover from the severe climatic changes, giving way to forests, grasslands, and rivers teeming with life. The once barren landscapes began to flourish with vegetation, and the animals that had adapted to the cold now evolved to meet the needs of the changing world. The climate was no longer an oppressive force, but an opportunity for the human species to thrive in new ways. Yet, with these changes came new challenges, ones that would require even greater intelligence, greater adaptability, and, perhaps most importantly, a deeper connection to the Earth and to each other. Homo sapiens had already begun to take shape in the late stages of the Ice Age, emerging as a distinct species from their Homo erectus ancestors. Their physical features, slighter frames, more rounded skulls, and larger brains, marked a significant leap in evolution. The brain, in particular, was growing larger and more sophisticated, indicating a capacity for more complex thought, communication, and social interaction. With this increase in cognitive ability came the ability to engage with the world in ways that no other species could. Homo sapiens began to develop a deeper understanding of their surroundings, and they started to see the world not as a series of isolated challenges but as a vast, interconnected system of nature. The creation of more sophisticated tools, the development of symbolic art, and the mastery of language all pointed to a species that was beginning to think and experience life on a more profound level. The rise of Homo sapiens did not happen in isolation. It was a part of a larger transformation that swept through the Earth's ecosystems. As the glaciers melted and the land warmed, humans were faced with new environments, new challenges, and new opportunities. The lush forests and sprawling grasslands were now home to a new generation of creatures, some familiar, some strange. The megafauna of the Ice Age, like mammoths and mastodons, were disappearing, making way for a new set of animals better suited to the warmer world. In response, Homo sapiens adapted to the changing climate by developing more specialized tools, more advanced hunting techniques, and more intricate social structures. No longer just gathering and scavenging, humans began to hunt in more organized and cooperative ways, leading to more efficient food production and a greater understanding of the ecosystems around them. The transition from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a more settled existence was perhaps the most significant transformation of all. This was a time when humans began to harness the power of the land, not just as a means of survival but as a source of prosperity. The domestication of plants and animals marked the beginning of agriculture, a turning point that would have far-reaching consequences for the trajectory of human history. Early humans, once nomadic and constantly on the move in search of food, now began to settle in one place, to plant crops, and to domesticate animals for food and labor. This shift from a transient lifestyle to a settled existence was both a practical necessity and a profound cultural shift. As humans learned to cultivate the earth, they gained more control over their environment and their future. The rise of agriculture marked the birth of the first permanent settlements and the foundation for the rise of cities, cultures, and civilizations. But this shift was not without its challenges. Settling down meant new forms of organization, new forms of cooperation, and, inevitably, new forms of conflict. Early humans, while forming close-knit tribes and communities, were still learning the delicate balance of managing resources, resolving disputes, and organizing for the collective good. The very shift to an agricultural society required new tools and technologies, ones that would enable humans to plow the earth, build shelters, and store food for the future. These technological advances were not just about survival, they were about creating the conditions for a new kind of life, one that would pave the way for the great civilizations that would rise in the millennia to come. As humans settled into their new way of life, they also began to develop new social structures. Tribes grew larger, and with that growth came new forms of leadership and governance. The egalitarian social structures of earlier humans began to give way to more hierarchical ones, as leaders emerged to oversee the distribution of resources and the management of increasingly complex societies. This shift toward social complexity would lay the foundation for the political systems, religions, and cultural institutions that would eventually define human civilization. Through it all, the essence of Homo sapiens, their remarkable adaptability, their capacity for innovation, their deepening social bonds, remained constant. The journey from survival to civilization was not easy, nor was it linear. It was a slow, steady evolution that required humans to push the boundaries of what was possible and to create a world not just for survival, but for thriving. And in this quiet revolution, the seeds of all human achievement were planted. From the mastery of tools and fire, to the development of art and language, to the birth of agriculture and cities, each step in the journey of Homo sapiens marked a leap in understanding and a step toward a more complex and interconnected world. The dawn of agriculture marked a profound shift in the human experience. As the first permanent settlements began to form, so too did the foundation of what would become human civilization. For the first time, humans were no longer at the mercy of the seasons or the whims of the land. With the domestication of plants and animals, they gained the ability to produce food more efficiently, to control their environment, and to secure their future. The days of wandering and foraging were over, the time of building, creating, and controlling had arrived. The fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia, the Nile, and the Indus became the cradles of civilization, where the first cities began to take shape and the future of humanity began to unfold. Yet, as the human population grew, so too did the complexity of their societies. What began as small agricultural communities gradually evolved into larger settlements. As these communities expanded, they began to require more organization, more structure, and more leadership. No longer could everyone simply live as equals, sharing resources and responsibilities. The division of labor became necessary, and with it came the emergence of distinct social classes. The creation of permanent dwellings, the rise of agriculture, and the accumulation of wealth led to the development of a new social order, one where power and resources were no longer equally distributed. This shift in social structure brought with it a series of new challenges. As human communities became more complex, so too did the potential for conflict. The earliest settlements were often built along fertile riverbanks, which provided abundant resources for agriculture. But with so much at stake, competition for land and resources became inevitable. The tribes and clans that once worked together as extended families now found themselves at odds, fighting for dominance and control. Wars, raiding parties, and territorial disputes began to punctuate human history in ways that were unfamiliar to their hunter-gatherer ancestors. The need for security, protection, and leadership became paramount, and the first warrior kings, chiefs, and rulers began to rise. It was during this period of growing complexity that the first true cities began to emerge. In places like Uruk and Ur in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt along the Nile, and the early settlements of the Indus Valley, the foundations of urban life were being laid. These cities were unlike anything that had come before them. They were centers of trade, politics, culture, and religion, places where ideas, goods, and people from far-flung regions converged. The city became a symbol of human achievement, a monument to what could be accomplished when people worked together to shape their environment. These early cities were often surrounded by defensive walls, as the constant threat of external raids and internal unrest became a part of daily life. But within the walls, a different kind of world was emerging, one where art, literature, and science could flourish. The rise of the city was not just a shift in how humans lived, it was also a transformation in how they thought about themselves and their place in the world. In these early civilizations, the role of religion and spirituality became more pronounced. The first temples and religious structures began to take shape, and with them came the birth of organized religion. Early humans were no longer just living in relation to the natural world, they were now living in relation to a higher order, one that they believed governed their lives. The gods, the spirits, and the divine forces were seen as powerful entities that influenced everything from the changing of the seasons to the success of the harvest. In this new world, religious leaders held significant power, guiding the people through both spiritual and practical matters. The divine and the earthly became intertwined, and the struggle for control over both realms was a driving force behind the rise of early political systems. As civilization began to take root, so too did the development of writing. The need to record information, whether for trade, taxation, or religious purposes, led to the invention of the first written languages. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians created cuneiform, while the ancient Egyptians developed hieroglyphics. Writing allowed early humans to capture knowledge, preserve stories, and document events in a way that oral traditions alone could never achieve. With writing came the ability to pass on knowledge across generations, allowing ideas, innovations, and discoveries to be shared, built upon, and expanded. The written word became a powerful tool, not just for communication, but for organizing society, maintaining laws, and establishing order. The emergence of cities and writing was accompanied by the development of trade. As settlements grew and people began to specialize in different crafts, the need for goods beyond what could be produced locally became apparent. The exchange of goods and ideas across distances became essential for the growth of civilization. The rise of trade routes, both over land and by sea, allowed civilizations to exchange not just material goods, but knowledge, culture, and technology. The exchange of ideas between the early civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China led to advances in mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and engineering. These early societies were not isolated from one another, they were interconnected, each contributing to the larger story of human progress. But with all these advancements came new challenges. The rise of cities and civilizations also brought with it the need for governance and law. As societies grew in size and complexity, so too did the need for order and control. The first legal codes began to emerge, with laws governing everything from property rights to criminal justice. The Code of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, one of the earliest and most famous legal codes, was a product of this need for order. But with these legal systems came a new kind of inequality. Laws were often skewed in favor of the wealthy and powerful, and the divisions between social classes became more entrenched. The growth of early civilization marked the beginning of a new chapter in human history. The shift from nomadic life to permanent settlements, the rise of cities and trade, the development of religion and writing, all of these things set the stage for the future of humanity. The seeds of technology, culture, and governance were planted, and with them, the foundation of what we now recognize as civilization was established. Yet, for all the progress that had been made, early human societies were still in their infancy, and the challenges ahead were as profound as those that had come before. The journey from survival to civilization had only just begun. As the ancient cities began to flourish, humanity was entering a new phase of its evolution, one marked by rapid advancements and increasing complexity. The world of early humans had once been defined by survival and adaptation to the land. Now, with the rise of agriculture, the establishment of permanent settlements, and the development of trade, early civilizations were beginning to create a world shaped by human agency and ambition. But with this newfound power came new challenges not just of survival, but of identity, governance, and morality. The complexities of living in large, densely populated cities demanded new forms of social organization, new methods of decision-making, and new ways of understanding power and control. As these early civilizations began to organize, the question of how to manage the growing diversity of human needs, desires, and ambitions became a defining issue. In these early urban centers, the first examples of governance began to take shape. No longer could societies rely on small, family-based groups to make decisions and distribute resources. The sheer scale of urban life required new systems of order. The first kings, priests, and rulers emerged, and with them, the birth of formal leadership. The role of leadership was no longer simply to protect and provide for the group, it had become about maintaining order, controlling resources, and managing conflict. The concept of the state, of political authority, was being born. As the walls of these ancient cities grew taller and more imposing, so too did the power structures that governed them. The relationship between the ruler and the ruled became one of the most important dynamics in early civilization. The rise of kingship and the idea of divine rule brought with it the creation of elaborate systems of social stratification. Kings, often seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people, were the focal point of authority. They were not just political leaders but also spiritual figures, tasked with maintaining harmony between the divine and earthly realms. Their rule was often justified by religious beliefs, and their authority was derived from a perceived connection to the gods. This intertwining of politics and religion created a society where power was not just a matter of laws and policies, but of divine will and cosmic order. But not all leaders were kings. In other parts of the world, different forms of governance took hold. In the Indus Valley, for example, the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa exhibited a remarkable degree of urban planning, with well-organized streets, drainage systems, and standardized brick sizes. The lack of evidence of grand palaces or temples in these cities has led some historians to suggest that power may have been more decentralized, with leadership more communal or based on a more egalitarian system. Yet, even in these cases, the need for cooperation, order, and organization was clear. The rise of these ancient cities marked the beginning of a more complex relationship between humans and the world they had created. The invention of writing played a key role in this transition. Early writing systems, such as cuneiform in Mesopotamia and hieroglyphics in Egypt, allowed humans to communicate in new ways, to record their histories, and to preserve knowledge for future generations. These systems were not just tools for trade and administration, they were instruments of power. The written word allowed leaders to assert their authority, codify laws, and dictate how society would function. But writing also gave rise to a new kind of human relationship, the relationship between the written word and the individual. For the first time in history, individuals could leave a permanent record of their lives and thoughts. With this came a shift in human consciousness. No longer were stories passed only through oral traditions, which could be forgotten or altered. Now, knowledge could be preserved across generations, and the potential for innovation and change grew exponentially. Alongside the development of governance and writing came the growth of religion and spirituality. In the early civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, religion was inseparable from daily life. Temples and shrines were built to honor the gods, and rituals were performed to ensure the prosperity of the community. Religion provided not just a moral code but a framework for understanding the cosmos. It gave meaning to the natural world, to life and death, and to the cycles of nature. In these early societies, the gods were seen as active participants in human affairs. The weather, the harvest, the birth of children, all were seen as directly influenced by divine forces. The gods, in turn, were worshipped, appeased, and invoked for favor. But the growth of religion also brought with it the growth of inequality. The priests, who held the knowledge of the gods and the power to mediate between the divine and the mortal, became powerful figures in society. In some cases, priests held more power than the rulers themselves, as they controlled access to spiritual knowledge and ritual practices that could influence the fate of the entire community. This concentration of religious power often intersected with political power, creating a ruling elite that was both secular and spiritual in nature. The elite, however, did not represent the interests of the entire population. Most people in these early civilizations lived in poverty, working the land or laboring in the temples, while a small minority held most of the wealth and power. The vast majority of people had little control over their own lives, and their survival depended on the favor of those in power. The rise of these early civilizations was, in many ways, a triumph of human ingenuity and cooperation. The creation of cities, the development of agriculture, the rise of governance, and the birth of writing all marked milestones in the evolution of human society. But with this progress came new challenges and contradictions. The growth of cities and the division of labor created new inequalities and social hierarchies. The power structures that emerged were often designed to protect the elite and maintain control over the resources that fueled the civilization. The development of writing allowed for the preservation of knowledge, but it also gave rise to the concept of ownership. Ideas, property, and even people could now be owned and controlled. For all the achievements of early civilization, the struggle for equality, justice, and freedom had already begun. The seeds of conflict that would shape human history for millennia had been planted. These early civilizations, though remarkable in their achievements, were not free from the same human flaws that had plagued humanity since the dawn of time. Power, inequality, and the fight for survival were still at the heart of the human story. But it was in these early cities that the framework for a new kind of society was being built, one that would evolve, grow, and change in ways that no one could yet imagine. As the ancient civilizations began to spread across the globe, humanity found itself at a crossroads, poised between the past and an uncertain future. The great cities of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley had flourished, creating societies that were more advanced and more interconnected than ever before. But these societies were not isolated from one another. The rise of trade routes, both over land and by sea, connected distant civilizations, creating a network of exchange that was unlike anything seen before. With these connections came not only the exchange of goods but also the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The world was becoming a smaller place, and the potential for collaboration and conflict grew exponentially. The spread of new technologies was one of the most profound aspects of this interconnected world. The wheel, for example, which had been invented in Mesopotamia, spread across the ancient world, revolutionizing transportation and trade. Likewise, the knowledge of writing, which had first emerged in the cradles of civilization, was adopted by different cultures, from the Sumerians to the Egyptians to the Phoenicians, who created an alphabet that would later influence the development of Western writing systems. These innovations were not merely technical, they were the foundation upon which entire civilizations could build. The ability to write, to record history, to document laws, and to communicate over long distances was a game-changer, one that would lay the groundwork for the spread of knowledge and the creation of empires. But as the world grew more interconnected, it also became more complex. The trade routes that brought prosperity also brought conflict. The ancient cities that once flourished in relative isolation were now vulnerable to attack from foreign invaders, rival city-states, and nomadic peoples from the periphery of civilization. The constant competition for resources, power, and control led to wars and conquests that would reshape the ancient world. And yet, these conflicts were not solely about destruction. They were also about cultural exchange and the blending of ideas. As empires rose and fell, they left their mark on the cultures they conquered, leaving behind a legacy of art, language, religion, and technology that would shape the future of humanity. The rise of empires in the ancient world marked a new phase in the evolution of human society. Empires such as the Akkadian, Babylonian, Egyptian, and later the Persian and Roman empires, expanded far beyond their original borders, bringing new territories under their control. These empires were characterized by centralized power, large armies, and complex systems of governance. But they were also marked by the spread of culture, art, and innovation. As empires expanded, they brought new ideas and technologies to the regions they conquered, and in turn, they absorbed the knowledge and practices of those they conquered. The result was a fusion of cultures that led to the development of new art forms, philosophies, and technologies. The ancient world was becoming a vast melting pot of ideas, where the boundaries between civilizations were increasingly blurred. Yet, even as these empires flourished, they were not immune to the challenges that plagued earlier societies. The same forces that had driven the rise of civilizations, the quest for power, resources, and control, were also the forces that led to their downfall. Empires, by their very nature, were fragile, and the larger they became, the more difficult they were to maintain. The pressures of governing vast territories, managing diverse populations, and defending borders from external threats often proved to be too much. The collapse of empires, such as the fall of the Akkadian Empire or the decline of the Roman Empire, was not just a military defeat, it was a reflection of the inherent instability of large-scale political systems. These collapses were often followed by periods of fragmentation, where smaller, more localized kingdoms and tribes would rise to fill the power vacuum. Amidst the rise and fall of empires, a quieter revolution was taking place in the world of ideas. While the ancient world was still deeply influenced by religious beliefs and spiritual practices, it was also a time of profound intellectual growth. In cities such as Athens, Alexandria, and Pataliputra, philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists were beginning to ask fundamental questions about the nature of existence, the cosmos, and human nature. The rise of philosophy marked a significant departure from the religious explanations that had dominated early human thought. Thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in Greece, Confucius and Laozi in China, and the early Indian philosophers in the Vedic tradition, began to explore questions of ethics, governance, and the nature of knowledge itself. These intellectual traditions were not only about understanding the world, they were about changing it. Philosophy, for the first time in human history, began to offer a framework for thinking about society that was based on reason, debate, and the pursuit of knowledge. This intellectual awakening was crucial in shaping the future of human civilization. While the ancient religions continued to provide answers to questions of spirituality and the divine, philosophy began to offer new ways of understanding the human condition. It was in this intellectual ferment that the seeds of democracy, science, and rational thought were planted, seeds that would later grow into the foundations of the modern world. Yet, despite the intellectual advances of the time, the rise of empires and the spread of civilization were not without their costs. The very advances that allowed for the flourishing of cities and empires also created new inequalities, divisions, and struggles. The gap between the elite and the common people grew wider, as those in power increasingly used their influence to maintain control. The urbanization of the ancient world led to the growth of a class of wealthy elites who controlled the resources and the means of production. Meanwhile, the majority of the population, laborers, farmers, and artisans, continued to live in poverty, subject to the whims of their rulers. The rise of slavery in the ancient world was a direct consequence of these inequalities, as conquered peoples and those on the margins of society were forced into servitude to sustain the empire. In many ways, the ancient world was a world of contradictions, one where extraordinary achievements in art, architecture, philosophy, and technology were accompanied by profound social inequalities, violence, and exploitation. The rise of cities, the birth of empires, and the spread of knowledge and culture were milestones in human history, but they also revealed the darker side of human nature, the thirst for power, the exploitation of the weak, and the constant struggle for resources. Yet, in the face of these contradictions, humanity continued to move forward, driven by an unyielding desire to understand the world and to shape it in their image. As the ancient world continued its relentless march forward, humanity found itself at a crossroads, with both immense potential and deep challenges ahead. The age of sprawling empires, intellectual revolutions, and cultural amalgamation was dawning, yet so too was the age of profound internal strife, inequality, and moral questioning. The world was becoming more connected, yet more divided. The achievements of earlier civilizations had set the stage for unprecedented growth, but these achievements also revealed the complexity of human society and the consequences of power. The progress of civilization, far from being a smooth ascent, was fraught with contradictions that would shape the trajectory of humanity for millennia to come. The great empires of the ancient world, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, became symbols of both human ambition and human frailty. The towering cities, monumental architecture, and advancements in science, philosophy, and politics demonstrated what humanity was capable of when it pooled its collective resources and knowledge. But alongside these accomplishments, the empires were also marked by brutal conquests, ruthless power struggles, and entrenched social hierarchies. The glories of civilization were often built on the backs of the oppressed, enslaved people, conquered peoples, and marginalized communities. The grandeur of ancient cities, like Babylon's Ishtar Gate or Rome's Colosseum, told stories of human ingenuity, but they also cast shadows of exploitation, inequality, and suffering. This dual nature of progress, its capacity for both brilliance and injustice, became a defining theme in the ancient world. As the empires grew, so too did the gap between the elite and the rest of the population. Power and wealth were increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority of the people lived in poverty or under harsh conditions. The ruling classes, often surrounded by opulence and luxury, justified their power through divine right, military prowess, or the maintenance of social order. Meanwhile, the common people, the laborers, farmers, and slaves, were relegated to the margins of society, struggling to survive in a world that seemed indifferent to their plight. The contradictions within these societies were not just economic, but moral as well. As empires expanded and cultural achievements flourished, so too did the capacity for cruelty. Slavery, an integral part of the ancient economy, was justified by the belief that certain people were destined to serve others, either because of their race, nationality, or status as war captives. The violence of conquest and the subjugation of entire peoples were rationalized by the idea that the conquered would be civilized or brought into the fold of the dominant culture. Yet this justification ignored the humanity of those who suffered under imperial rule. Their lives were reduced to commodities, their cultures erased, and their voices silenced. The ancient world, however, was not without its challengers to the status quo. In the midst of the vast empires and their oppressive systems, a countercurrent of thought and action began to emerge. Throughout the Mediterranean, in the streets of Athens, the courts of Alexandria, and the halls of Rome, philosophers and thinkers began to question the nature of power, justice, and morality. The rise of philosophy, especially in the works of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, offered a new framework for understanding the world. Rather than accepting the divine right of kings or the unquestioned authority of the state, these thinkers began to explore the concept of the ideal society, one built on reason, virtue, and justice. In Greece, the city-state of Athens became the birthplace of democracy, a revolutionary experiment in self-rule. For the first time in human history, the idea that all citizens should have a voice in the governance of their society began to take shape. This new form of government, though limited in scope and flawed in its implementation, represented a radical departure from the hierarchical systems of rule that had dominated the ancient world. The rise of democracy in Athens symbolized the potential for human societies to evolve from autocratic rule to participatory governance. It marked the beginning of a political philosophy that would later inspire revolutions and movements for human rights throughout history. Yet, despite these philosophical advancements, the inequalities of the ancient world were not easily overcome. In Athens, while free male citizens were granted political rights, women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded from the political process. The same could be said for the other great civilizations of the time. Even in the Roman Republic, which prided itself on its system of checks and balances, political power was concentrated in the hands of a small elite. The vast majority of people, though they might have been citizens in name, were powerless to influence the direction of the state. As the ancient world grappled with these contradictions, a new force began to emerge: the rise of empires outside the traditional boundaries of the Mediterranean world. The Persian Empire, for example, expanded across vast stretches of territory, from Egypt to India, and presented an alternative model of governance. Under the leadership of kings like Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire promoted policies of tolerance and respect for local cultures. The Persian approach to governance, which allowed for a degree of local autonomy within a broader imperial framework, stood in stark contrast to the rigid control of empires like Rome. This policy of tolerance was reflected in the Persian religion, Zoroastrianism, which emphasized the duality of good and evil, as well as the individual's role in the cosmic struggle between these forces. In China, the rise of the Qin dynasty and the subsequent development of the imperial system marked the beginning of a new phase of Chinese history. Under the rule of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, China was unified for the first time, and a central bureaucracy was established. The construction of the Great Wall of China, the creation of a standardized currency, and the development of a unified legal code were monumental achievements in the history of civilization. Yet, these achievements came at a great cost. The Qin dynasty was marked by harsh rule, heavy taxation, and widespread repression. The emperor's quest for immortality led to the burning of books and the suppression of intellectual thought, stifling the very creativity that had made China one of the world's oldest and most advanced civilizations. The rise of these new empires, both in the East and West, demonstrated the enduring power of human ambition. The ancient world, with all its contradictions, was a testament to humanity's drive to create, to conquer, and to organize society. But it was also a world where power was often abused, where inequality was entrenched, and where the voices of the oppressed were too often silenced. The ancient empires, with their glorious achievements and tragic flaws, were the crucibles in which the ideas and structures of the modern world would be forged. In the midst of these empires and their struggles, humanity continued to evolve, not just biologically, but intellectually and morally. The challenges of the ancient world were not just the challenges of survival, they were the challenges of understanding, of creating meaning in a world that was often indifferent to human suffering. The ancient world was, in many ways, a mirror of the modern world, full of promise and potential, but also rife with conflict and inequality. And as humanity moved forward, the lessons of the ancient world would continue to echo throughout history, shaping the future of civilizations to come. As the ancient empires reached the zenith of their power, a new chapter in human history was being written, one that would see the rise of ideas that would shape the future in ways unimaginable to those who lived in the heart of these civilizations. The very idea of progress, of human potential to shape the world according to reason, justice, and compassion, began to emerge in the intellectual hearts of the ancient world. It was during this time that the foundations of philosophy, science, and ethics were laid, marking the dawn of a new era of human consciousness. In the great cities of Athens, Alexandria, and Pataliputra, philosophers began to challenge the assumptions of the age. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, towering figures in Greek philosophy, wrestled with fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge, virtue, and the good life. Socrates famously declared that the unexamined life is not worth living, suggesting that the search for wisdom, understanding, and self-awareness was the true purpose of human existence. This pursuit of self-examination and moral clarity was revolutionary, contrasting sharply with the dogma of religious tradition and the authority of kings. For the first time, humans were being asked to look inward, to think critically, and to understand that their actions, thoughts, and desires were not predetermined by the gods, but shaped by their own choices and moral reasoning. Plato, Socrates' student, expanded on this idea by proposing his theory of the ideal state, one governed not by the whims of rulers, but by philosopher kings who would govern with wisdom and justice. His vision of a just society was one where reason and virtue guided every aspect of life, from politics to education to the relationships between individuals. Plato's ideas on governance, knowledge, and ethics would influence generations of thinkers, shaping political theory for centuries. In the Mediterranean, the works of Aristotle built on Plato's foundations but grounded them more firmly in empirical observation. Aristotle's contributions to logic, biology, and ethics revolutionized the way humans understood the natural world and the moral order of society. His belief in the potential for human beings to achieve greatness through virtue and reason would inspire both the Renaissance and the Enlightenment centuries later. Meanwhile, to the east in India, the philosophical schools of thought developed in the shadows of the great empires offered alternative views of human existence. In the Upanishads and the teachings of Buddha, a radical departure from the dominant religious practices of the time emerged, one that sought not power or control, but inner peace and self-realization. The core tenets of Buddhism, especially the concepts of suffering, impermanence, and the possibility of enlightenment, resonated deeply with the human desire to understand life beyond the physical world. The Buddha's teachings on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path provided a roadmap for individuals to achieve liberation from suffering, offering an alternative to the materialism and social hierarchies that dominated the ancient world. While the intellectual ferment in the West and East was revolutionary, it did not occur in isolation. In the Middle East, the Persian Empire was experiencing a cultural renaissance of its own. Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion of Persia, provided its adherents with a dualistic worldview, in which good and evil were seen as opposing forces in a cosmic struggle. This worldview would later influence not only Judaism, Christianity, and Islam but also the broader development of Western religious thought. The idea of a single, all-powerful God who governed the universe, the divine struggle between good and evil, and the eventual triumph of righteousness over corruption were central to Zoroastrianism and would echo throughout the monotheistic religions that arose in the centuries to come. In the Far East, China was undergoing its own intellectual and cultural transformation. Confucianism, founded by the philosopher Confucius, sought to bring harmony and order to society through a focus on virtue, filial piety, and social relationships. Confucianism emphasized the importance of respect for authority, the cultivation of personal virtues, and the maintenance of social harmony, principles that would become deeply embedded in Chinese society and have a profound influence on the region for millennia. Alongside Confucianism, Taoism, with its focus on living in harmony with the Tao, or the Way, offered a more spiritual and less structured approach to life. Taoism, with its reverence for nature and emphasis on balance, influenced not only Chinese philosophy but also the arts, medicine, and governance throughout East Asia. Despite the intellectual and philosophical advancements that were taking place across the globe, the political landscape of the ancient world remained fraught with violence and instability. The rise of empires had brought with it the centralization of power, but it had also fostered an environment of competition, conquest, and tyranny. The very rulers who embodied the ideals of justice and virtue often ruled with an iron fist, maintaining power through military might and ruthless suppression of dissent. The Roman Empire, for example, though it established many of the principles of governance that would later be admired by Enlightenment thinkers, was built on the backs of slaves, the conquest of foreign lands, and the violent suppression of rebellions. The ideal of the Roman Republic, of a government in which citizens had a say, had long since eroded under the weight of imperial ambitions and authoritarian rule. In the East, the Chinese Empire, unified under the Qin dynasty, faced its own challenges. The emperor's obsessive quest for control led to brutal measures, such as the burning of books and the execution of scholars. Despite its unification of China and the construction of monumental structures like the Great Wall, the Qin dynasty was marked by heavy-handed rule and cruelty, leading to its swift collapse after only a few short decades. In Persia, the Achaemenid Empire, under leaders like Darius and Xerxes, sought to maintain stability through a policy of tolerance for local customs and religions, but the empire's vast size made it difficult to govern effectively, and it too eventually crumbled under the pressure of invasion and internal strife. Thus, as humanity progressed intellectually and culturally, the empire-building pursuits that had once been seen as the pinnacle of civilization increasingly revealed their flaws. The tension between intellectual growth and political oppression created a complex legacy for the ancient world, a world of ideas that challenged the status quo, but also one in which the forces of power often stifled true progress. The lessons of these contradictions would echo throughout history, shaping the path of human civilization for centuries to come. As the ancient world continued to evolve, the structures that once held civilizations together were beginning to fracture. The great empires of the East and West, which had spanned vast territories and held immense power, began to crumble under the weight of their own complexities. In the West, the fall of the Roman Empire signaled the end of an era, not just politically, but culturally and philosophically. The vast territories once unified under Roman rule splintered into smaller, feudal kingdoms, and a sense of unity was lost. The Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and stability, was replaced by centuries of conflict, warfare, and instability, what would later be known as the Dark Ages. But even in the midst of this chaos, the ideas of ancient thinkers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and others, continued to resonate. They provided a foundation for future generations to rebuild upon, not just in terms of governance and politics, but in the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. The fall of Rome did not mark the end of intellectual and cultural achievement, however. While the Western Roman Empire dissolved, the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive for another 1,000 years, preserving much of the knowledge and culture of antiquity. The Byzantines were instrumental in maintaining the philosophical and scientific legacies of Greece and Rome, and their scholars helped to keep the flame of knowledge alive during the darker periods of Western history. As the Byzantine Empire preserved classical learning, it also became a melting pot of cultures, a bridge between the ancient world and the Islamic Golden Age, which was to come. In the East, a different kind of transformation was unfolding. In India, the rise of Buddhism and Hinduism continued to influence the spiritual and intellectual landscape. The spiritual insights of the Buddha, emphasizing the impermanence of life, the nature of suffering, and the path to enlightenment, began to spread across Asia, from China to Southeast Asia, where it found fertile ground for growth. Hinduism, with its deep philosophical traditions and concepts of karma and moksha, continued to evolve, offering spiritual guidance to millions of followers. The Vedic scriptures and the teachings of sages like Patanjali shaped the moral and philosophical underpinnings of South Asia. Meanwhile, in China, the philosophical and spiritual traditions of Confucianism and Taoism continued to shape society. Confucianism, with its emphasis on hierarchy, respect, and moral duty, became the foundation for Chinese governance, education, and social order for centuries to come. The concept of filial piety, respect for one's ancestors, and the importance of maintaining harmony within society permeated Chinese culture, helping to stabilize the often fractious states of China. Taoism, with its emphasis on simplicity, balance, and living in harmony with the natural world, provided a counterpoint to the structured rigidity of Confucianism, offering a more personal and spiritual path for many. The philosophy of the Tao influenced art, literature, and medicine, while also giving rise to practices like Tai Chi and acupuncture, which are still integral to Chinese culture today. In the Middle East, the rise of Islam brought about a profound shift in the philosophical, cultural, and political landscape. With the life and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, Islam became not just a religion, but a way of life. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, provided a framework for governance, law, and ethics, while the hadiths, the sayings and actions of the Prophet, served as a guide for personal conduct. The spread of Islam during the caliphates brought with it a flowering of intellectual activity known as the Islamic Golden Age. In cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo, scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, preserving and expanding upon the knowledge of antiquity. This intellectual renaissance led to significant advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The work of thinkers like Avicenna, Averroes, and Al-Ghazali would influence both the Islamic world and, centuries later, the European Renaissance. During this period, the concept of the university as a place of higher learning began to take shape. The first universities in the Islamic world were established, bringing together scholars from different cultures and traditions to engage in dialogue and exchange. This intellectual movement would later influence Europe, where universities in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford would rise to prominence. The intellectual legacy of the Islamic Golden Age, along with the preservation and expansion of classical knowledge, became a crucial bridge between the ancient world and the medieval and Renaissance periods. However, while the intellectual life of the ancient and medieval world continued to flourish, the political and social structures that governed these civilizations remained unstable. The Byzantine Empire eventually fell to the Ottoman Turks, and the Western European kingdoms, though they would eventually come together to form modern states, were embroiled in constant warfare, territorial disputes, and dynastic struggles. The rise of feudalism in Europe created a rigid social structure, with lords and vassals at the top and peasants at the bottom. This hierarchical system led to economic and social inequality, and the vast majority of the population lived in poverty, bound by land, labor, and the whims of their rulers. In Asia, the Chinese Empire, despite its long-lasting stability, also faced periods of fragmentation and invasion. The Mongols, under Genghis Khan and his successors, created an empire that spanned from China to Europe, disrupting the traditional power structures of the region. The Mongol invasions, while destructive, also facilitated cultural exchange and the movement of ideas across Eurasia. The Mongols helped to open up trade routes such as the Silk Road, facilitating the spread of goods, technologies, and knowledge between East and West. The rise of Islam, the spread of Confucianism, and the various empires of Asia and Europe all contributed to the global tapestry of human civilization. Despite the political and social upheavals, humanity continued to push forward, building on the intellectual and philosophical achievements of the past. As the ancient world transformed, the seeds of a new global order were being planted, one in which ideas, cultures, and religions would continue to mix, merge, and evolve. The legacy of the ancient world, with its contradictions and complexities, would shape the future of humanity in ways that were still yet to be fully realized. As the ancient world gave way to the medieval period, a sense of deep transformation unfolded, reshaping the contours of human existence in ways that would resonate for centuries to come. The collapse of empires, the rise of new political and religious forces, and the shifts in intellectual and social structures marked a pivotal moment in the course of history. These changes were not abrupt or violent in every case, rather, they often unfolded gradually, each step an evolution built upon the intellectual and cultural foundations laid by those who came before. It was a time of fragmentation, yet also of profound reformation, as humanity sought to rediscover, reimagine, and rebuild what had been lost. In Europe, the fall of the Western Roman Empire had left a vacuum that was filled by a multitude of kingdoms and tribes. The rise of feudalism created a rigid social hierarchy, with kings, lords, and vassals at the top and peasants bound to the land at the bottom. The medieval period was marked by the decentralization of power, as kings and emperors were often unable to maintain control over the vast territories they ruled. This fragmentation led to an age of constant warfare, territorial disputes, and shifting allegiances. Yet, it was also during this time that some of the most enduring political and social structures were established. The Church, which had emerged as a powerful institution in the wake of the Roman Empire's collapse, became a stabilizing force in medieval Europe. Christianity, with its emphasis on order, morality, and the afterlife, provided a sense of unity in a fractured world, offering spiritual guidance in the face of political instability. The Catholic Church, under the leadership of the Pope, was not just a religious authority, it was a political and cultural one as well. The Church controlled vast lands, influenced kings and emperors, and even had its own armies. The establishment of monastic orders, like the Benedictines, further entrenched the Church's presence in everyday life, as monasteries became centers of learning, preservation of knowledge, and social care. In the monasteries, ancient texts were copied and preserved, ensuring that the wisdom of the ancient world, from Greek and Roman philosophy to the writings of early Christians, would survive through the centuries. While much of Europe was embroiled in feudal disputes and political chaos, the Church stood as a symbol of continuity and unity, its monasteries offering a space for reflection, study, and devotion. However, the rise of the Church as a dominant force was not without its challenges. As the medieval world entered the High Middle Ages, a new intellectual movement began to take shape, one that sought to reconcile faith with reason. The philosophy of scholasticism, championed by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, aimed to harmonize the teachings of the Church with the philosophical principles of Aristotle and other ancient thinkers. Aquinas, in particular, argued that reason and faith were not mutually exclusive but rather complementary paths to understanding the truth. His synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy laid the groundwork for the intellectual revival that would take place in the coming centuries. This period of intellectual ferment was not confined to Europe. In the Islamic world, the preservation and expansion of knowledge flourished. The Islamic Golden Age, which began in the 8th century, saw the emergence of brilliant scholars who made groundbreaking contributions in fields like mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Córdoba translated the works of Greek, Roman, and Indian thinkers into Arabic, making them accessible to a new generation of scholars. The works of Aristotle, Plato, and Ptolemy were expanded upon, and new scientific discoveries were made in fields ranging from optics to chemistry. The Islamic world also produced great philosophers such as Avicenna and Averroes, whose writings influenced both the Islamic world and later Western thought. The intellectual advancements of the Islamic Golden Age were not merely academic, they also had practical implications. The development of advanced medical techniques, such as surgical procedures and the use of anesthetics, improved the quality of life for countless people. In mathematics, the development of algebra and the refinement of geometry laid the foundation for modern science and engineering. The preservation and expansion of knowledge in the Islamic world during this period helped bridge the gap between the ancient world and the coming Renaissance. Meanwhile, in China, the intellectual and technological advancements of the Tang and Song dynasties laid the groundwork for a cultural and scientific renaissance. The invention of paper, the printing press, and gunpowder transformed society, while Chinese scholars continued to build upon the philosophical traditions of Confucianism and Taoism. The Tang dynasty, in particular, was a golden age for Chinese art and culture, as poetry, painting, and sculpture flourished. The spread of Buddhism from India continued to influence Chinese thought, with Chan Buddhism, later known as Zen in Japan, offering a new spiritual path focused on meditation and the direct experience of enlightenment. The synthesis of Buddhism with native Chinese traditions gave rise to a distinct form of spiritual practice that would spread throughout East Asia. The cultural and intellectual developments of the medieval period were not confined to the East and West. In sub-Saharan Africa, kingdoms like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai thrived, fostering trade and cultural exchange. The Mali Empire, in particular, became a center of learning and scholarship, with the city of Timbuktu becoming a renowned center for Islamic scholarship and education. The wealth and prosperity of these empires, fueled by trade in gold, salt, and other valuable goods, allowed for the flourishing of arts, architecture, and intellectual exchange. African scholars made significant contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, and their work influenced both the Islamic world and later European discoveries. Despite the advances in intellectual thought and technology, the medieval period was also marked by significant challenges. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, killed millions of people, causing widespread devastation and societal upheaval. Famine, war, and religious conflict were constant threats to stability. The 100 Years' War between England and France, the Crusades to reclaim the Holy Land, and the Inquisition all contributed to a climate of fear, uncertainty, and violence. Yet even in the face of these challenges, the seeds of the Renaissance were being sown, as the ideas and achievements of the ancient world, the Islamic Golden Age, and the medieval intellectual movements began to converge, setting the stage for a new age of discovery, creativity, and human flourishing. The medieval period, with all its complexities and contradictions, was not a dark age but a time of transition, between the fall of ancient empires and the birth of a new world order. The intellectual, cultural, and spiritual advancements of the time were foundational to the rise of the modern world. In many ways, it was a time when humanity looked back to the past, to the lessons of ancient civilizations, while also pushing forward, laying the groundwork for the future. As the medieval period drew to a close, the world was on the cusp of a transformation that would usher in a new era of exploration, creativity, and intellectual awakening. The Renaissance, born from the ashes of the Dark Ages, would emerge as a beacon of human potential, a time when the ancient world's wisdom was revived and applied in novel ways. This period marked the beginning of a shift that would forever alter the course of human history, propelling humanity forward with unprecedented energy and ambition. But while the Renaissance is often celebrated for its artistic and intellectual achievements, it was also a time marked by profound tension, as old ideas collided with new ones, and the promise of progress came with its own set of challenges. At the heart of this transformation was the rediscovery of classical learning. In the intellectual hubs of Italy, scholars began to revive the works of ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, poets, and scientists, many of which had been lost to the Western world for centuries. The humanist movement, which emphasized the study of classical texts and the potential for human achievement, flourished in cities like Florence, Rome, and Venice. Thinkers like Petrarch, Erasmus, and Machiavelli sought to reconnect with the wisdom of the ancients, exploring themes of morality, politics, and human nature. These humanists believed that by understanding the great works of the past, they could shape a better future for humanity, one based on reason, creativity, and individual potential. This intellectual revival found expression in the arts, where artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael created masterpieces that celebrated the beauty of the human form, the complexities of the natural world, and the depth of human emotion. The Renaissance was not just a time of intellectual rebirth but also a flourishing of artistic innovation. Artists explored new techniques, such as linear perspective and chiaroscuro, which allowed them to create more realistic and three-dimensional works. These advancements in artistic technique reflected a new way of thinking about the world, one that was grounded in observation, experience, and the potential for human mastery of nature. But the Renaissance was not just a time of artistic and intellectual flourishing. It was also a period of profound social, political, and religious upheaval. The Catholic Church, which had held immense power during the medieval period, found itself challenged by new ideas and movements. The Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, broke the religious monopoly of the Church, leading to a series of religious wars, social unrest, and the fragmentation of Christianity in Europe. Luther's challenge to the authority of the Pope and his insistence on individual access to Scripture reshaped the religious landscape, encouraging people to think for themselves, to question established authorities, and to consider the relationship between the individual and the divine. The Reformation was not just a religious movement but a cultural one as well. It encouraged a greater focus on personal faith, direct access to religious texts, and the idea of salvation through personal devotion rather than through the intercession of the Church. In some ways, the Reformation mirrored the intellectual currents of the Renaissance, as both movements emphasized the power and potential of the individual. Yet, while the Renaissance celebrated human achievement in the arts and sciences, the Reformation focused more on the spiritual and moral dimensions of life. It was a reminder that even as humanity reached for greatness, it was also deeply flawed, in need of redemption and renewal. The rise of humanism and the Reformation also coincided with the age of exploration, as European nations began to look beyond their borders and seek new lands and resources. The voyages of explorers like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan opened up new frontiers, both geographically and intellectually. The world became smaller, and humanity's understanding of itself and its place in the universe expanded. As European powers established colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they brought with them not only new ideas and technologies but also the legacy of their own social, political, and religious structures. The Age of Exploration was, in many ways, a continuation of the Renaissance spirit of curiosity and discovery. The desire to understand the world and to push the boundaries of human knowledge drove explorers to chart unknown territories and to seek out new trade routes. Yet, this era of exploration was also marked by violence and exploitation, as indigenous peoples were often subjugated, enslaved, or wiped out by disease and war. The encounter between the European powers and the indigenous cultures of the Americas, Africa, and Asia created a complex legacy of cultural exchange, conflict, and exploitation that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. The Renaissance and the Age of Exploration, though rooted in a shared desire for knowledge and expansion, also revealed the contradictions of human progress. For every breakthrough in science, art, or philosophy, there was an accompanying cost. The pursuit of empire and the accumulation of wealth through trade and conquest often relied on the suffering of others, whether through the enslavement of indigenous peoples, the forced labor of African slaves, or the extraction of resources from colonized lands. The New World Order that emerged from this period of expansion and discovery was one that was shaped by both human ambition and human cruelty. In the centuries that followed, the Renaissance ideals of individualism, reason, and human potential would continue to influence the course of Western thought. The Enlightenment, which emerged in the 18th century, was directly shaped by the intellectual and cultural currents of the Renaissance. Thinkers like John Locke, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau would further develop ideas about human rights, democracy, and the power of reason, setting the stage for the modern world. The scientific revolution, driven by figures like Galileo, Newton, and Kepler, would challenge long-held beliefs about the nature of the universe, replacing superstition and dogma with empirical evidence and rational inquiry. Yet, as the Enlightenment unfolded, it became clear that the promise of human progress was not always realized in practice. The ideals of freedom, equality, and democracy were often contradicted by the realities of slavery, colonialism, and inequality. The rise of modern capitalism and industrialization brought new forms of exploitation, while the development of new technologies and weapons gave humanity the power to destroy itself on an unprecedented scale. The Renaissance, then, was not just a time of celebration but also a time of reckoning. It was a period in which humanity looked to the past for inspiration while also confronting its own limitations and contradictions. The ideals of the Renaissance, of human achievement, creativity, and reason, would continue to inspire and challenge future generations. Yet, they would also serve as a reminder that progress is not a linear path, and that the pursuit of knowledge and power often comes at a great cost. As humanity advanced through the Renaissance and entered the early modern period, it began to confront the realities of an increasingly complex world. The foundations laid by the Renaissance thinkers, explorers, and artists opened the door to new ideas, but these ideas also began to stir the forces of change that would lead to even greater upheaval. With the development of new technologies, the rise of nation-states, the birth of capitalism, and the continuing struggles for power and freedom, the modern era began to take shape. Yet, for all its advancements, this new world was one still grappling with the age-old question of what it meant to be human, and how human beings should relate to one another and to the world around them. One of the most defining features of the early modern period was the rapid pace of scientific and technological innovation. The scientific revolution, which began in the 16th century, fundamentally altered humanity's understanding of the natural world. Figures like Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, and Newton challenged centuries-old conceptions of the cosmos, introducing a new, evidence-based approach to understanding the universe. Galileo's telescope revealed a vast and dynamic cosmos, far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. Newton's laws of motion and gravity described the fundamental forces that governed everything from the fall of an apple to the movements of planets. These discoveries not only revolutionized science but also reshaped humanity's place in the universe. No longer were people the center of a divinely ordered, geocentric cosmos, but small players in an immense and impersonal universe governed by natural laws. This shift in perspective had profound philosophical and cultural implications. The rise of reason and empiricism as the primary ways of knowing created a new sense of human potential. No longer bound by superstition, religion, or ancient authority, people believed they could use reason and observation to improve their lives, their societies, and the world. The Enlightenment, which emerged in the 18th century, was the culmination of this shift in thought. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Locke argued for the primacy of reason, the rights of the individual, and the power of human agency. This intellectual movement laid the groundwork for the political revolutions that would reshape the world in the coming centuries, as the ideas of democracy, equality, and liberty began to challenge the old order of kings, emperors, and monarchies. However, while the Enlightenment's ideals of reason and progress were revolutionary, they also revealed the deep contradictions at the heart of the modern world. The idea of human rights, for example, was rooted in the belief that all people were born equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. Yet, this idea was not applied universally. Slavery, colonialism, and the oppression of women were still rampant, even as intellectuals championed liberty and equality. The Enlightenment thinkers themselves often supported or benefited from these systems of oppression, revealing the limits of their idealism. The promise of a more just and equitable world would remain unfulfilled for millions of people, and the contradictions between the ideals of freedom and the realities of exploitation would continue to haunt modern societies. The rise of capitalism in the wake of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution was another driving force behind the rapid changes of the modern world. The development of market economies, the growth of banking systems, and the expansion of international trade created new opportunities for wealth and power. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century, marked the beginning of an unprecedented era of economic growth, technological innovation, and social change. Factories and machines replaced handcrafts and agriculture as the primary means of production, transforming not only the economy but the fabric of society itself. The rapid expansion of industry brought both prosperity and misery. On one hand, the new factories, railways, and innovations in agriculture created wealth and raised the standard of living for many. On the other hand, the Industrial Revolution also led to the rise of slums, child labor, and the exploitation of workers. Cities became overcrowded, unsanitary, and rife with poverty, as millions of people left rural areas in search of work. The rise of a capitalist economy, while driving economic growth, also created vast inequalities, as wealth became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few. The political landscape of the modern world was also shifting rapidly. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, was one of the most significant events in modern history. It not only overturned the centuries-old monarchy but also challenged the very foundations of the old social and political order. The revolutionaries, inspired by Enlightenment ideals, sought to create a republic based on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet, the revolution was also marked by violence, instability, and the rise of radical factions, ultimately giving way to the rise of Napoleon and the establishment of the French Empire. The French Revolution was a powerful reminder that while the ideals of democracy and equality could inspire great change, they could also lead to chaos and destruction if not tempered by wisdom and caution. As Europe grappled with political upheaval, the rest of the world was being drawn into the vortex of modernization and imperialism. European powers, driven by a desire for resources and territory, embarked on a period of colonization that would reshape the globe. The so-called "scramble for Africa" in the late 19th century, along with the colonization of much of Asia and the Pacific, subjected millions of people to exploitation, violence, and cultural destruction. Imperialism was justified by a belief in the superiority of European civilization, but it also revealed the deep contradictions of the modern world. While European nations touted the virtues of liberty, progress, and reason, they were simultaneously engaged in the subjugation and exploitation of entire populations. Despite these contradictions, the modern world also saw the rise of movements for social change. The abolition of slavery, the struggle for women's rights, and the fight for workers' rights all gained momentum in the 19th and 20th centuries. These movements, while often slow and hard-fought, represented the ongoing struggle to bring the ideals of equality, justice, and freedom into reality. The work of abolitionists, suffragists, labor organizers, and civil rights activists continues to inspire social movements today. As the modern world continued to evolve, humanity was forced to confront the costs of its progress. The development of nuclear weapons, the environmental destruction caused by industrialization, and the deepening social inequalities created new challenges that threatened the very survival of the human race. Yet, in the face of these challenges, humanity's capacity for resilience, creativity, and collective action offers hope for the future. The journey that began millions of years ago, with the first steps of hominins out of the trees, continues to unfold in complex and unpredictable ways. In the end, the story of humanity is one of continual struggle, growth, and transformation, a story still in the making. As the 21st century unfolds, humanity stands at a precipice, looking both backward and forward. The past millennia of human evolution have brought us to a point where our technological advancements and global interconnectedness challenge the very essence of what it means to be human. The incredible achievements of the last few centuries, ranging from the dawn of the digital age to the exploration of space, have demonstrated the boundless potential of human ingenuity. Yet, with these advancements come profound questions, not just about what we can do, but what we should do, and what it all means for our future. The rapid pace of technological development has introduced a host of new challenges. In an age of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and virtual reality, humanity is faced with the prospect of radically altering the very nature of life itself. The idea of human enhancement, whether through biotechnology or cybernetics, is no longer the stuff of science fiction but a real and tangible possibility. These advancements could, in theory, allow us to extend life, enhance our cognitive abilities, and even transcend our biological limitations. Yet, they also bring with them deep ethical questions about the boundaries of human identity, the definition of what it means to be human, and the potential for inequality and abuse. At the same time, humanity is confronted with environmental crises that threaten the very survival of our species. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and the depletion of natural resources pose existential threats that require collective action on an unprecedented scale. The history of human civilization is, in many ways, a story of our relationship with the planet, how we have shaped it, and how it has shaped us. As we face these global challenges, we are reminded that the future of humanity is intertwined with the future of the Earth. In this context, the decisions we make today will determine the course of human evolution for generations to come. In this ever-changing world, one thing remains clear: the story of humanity is far from over. Our journey, from the first steps of our distant ancestors to the complexities of the modern age, continues to unfold. What lies ahead is uncertain, but the enduring drive to explore, understand, and shape the world remains as strong as ever.